you go about measuring something? Well, I guess it starts by defining, first of all, what it is that you're wanting to measure, right? This past weekend, Monica made some delicious chocolate chip cookies. She used measuring cups to make sure that she measured out the correct amount of the ingredients that she needed. When Monica or I do laundry at home, we put liquid soap into the cap and measure out how much we're going to need for the size of the specific load. When I put oil in my car, I usually buy 1 liter containers to help me measure out how much I'm putting in. And I check the dipstick afterwards to measure and make sure I haven't put in too much or too little. When I make coffee, I often measure out how much coffee I put into the filter, because nobody wants coffee that's too strong or too weak, right? I have a stopwatch and an alarm on my watch that I use to help me measure how long something might take to do. Some of you know that I live fairly close to the zoo and usually spend time there each week. And if you've been there and have seen the polar bears, then you know that they all have these black dots on their white fur. If you haven't seen them, that's what it looks like. And most people assume that it's to help tell them apart from one another. But the real reason is that the Winnipeg Zoo is part of a nationwide polar bear study that's trying to measure how fast polar bear fur grows. Now, I'm not sure why that's important to anybody, but obviously it is, so they measure it. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that we all have ways of measuring certain things in our daily life that are important to us. But I wonder, how do we measure where we're at spiritually? How do we measure spiritual growth? How do we measure our relationship with the Lord? How do we measure how we're doing in our personal discipleship? How do we measure if we are moving in the right direction spiritually? Some people try and measure growth by using a Bible checklist, and they check off each chapter of the Bible after they've read it. Some people use a journal and think that journaling is a great way to measure what you are learning and how you are growing. And those can all be great and helpful tools. But I'm not sure that either of those are complete. I love how Paul defines spiritual maturity in Philippians chapter 2. And he really does give us 5 ways to measure where we're at spiritually. The first way to measure our spiritual growth, Paul says, is to ask, how selfless am I? He writes in verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. The second way to measure your spiritual growth, Paul says, is to ask, how much am I willing to sacrifice? In verse 5, Paul encouraged his readers to have the same attitude that Jesus had. And in verse 6, this is what he writes. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. The third way to measure your spiritual growth is to ask, how much am I willing to serve? And again, Paul sets the bar pretty high here. He says concerning Jesus, he took on the humble position of a slave. The fourth measuring stick is, how much am I willing to submit? Paul continues on in this passage, and he reminds us that when he, that being Jesus, appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God. Well, the final measuring stick is found in verse 8, where Paul asks, how much am I willing to suffer? And how much was Jesus willing to suffer? Well, Paul writes this. He says, and he died a criminal's death on the cross. We often try and use more comfortable ways of measuring where we're at spiritually, don't we? But in the end, it might just have more to do with where our heart is at. How selfless are we willing to be? How much are we willing to sacrifice? How much are you serving? How willing are you to submit? And how much are you willing to suffer for the cause of Christ? Maybe those heart issues are the true test of our spiritual maturity.